Hello everyone, Bob here. In this video I'm just going to talk about what's perhaps my favorite decade of horror, the 1980s. I know many of you that follow my channel know I've been working my way backwards from the 2010s, the 2000s, and the 90s, and it's time for me to do my top 10 1980s horror films, or favorite 80s horror films. And that's still coming, I promise, but it's proving a lot trickier than I thought it would be to narrow it down to 10, because for me, in many ways, the 1980s is my golden era of horror films. It's the era I've seen the most of. It's the era I was born, but that doesn't really have any bearing on it other than the fact that that maybe makes me a little more nostalgic for it. The big thing about the 80s era, the first thing that pops out is that the 80s are perhaps best as the sequel era, or sequel decade of horror. Although, to be fair, all the Frankenstein and Dracula and Wolfman and all that had all their sequels back in Universal's heyday, way back in the 1930s through the 1950s. But the 1980s saw birth to the Friday the 13th franchise. 1980, then it saw all of its sequels all the way up to 1989. You had Part 8, so 8 out of the 10 years in the decade you had a Friday the 13th film. 1984, Nightmare on Elm Street came around, and after A Nightmare on Elm Street came out, by the time 1989 rolled around, we were already on A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, The Dream Child. In 1981, the Halloween franchise saw its first sequel, Halloween 2. A year later, Halloween 3 Season of the Witch was made, and if you know anything about that franchise, you know that it tried to go the anthology route. It didn't work, so in 1988 we got Halloween 4 The Return of Michael Myers, and a year later we had Halloween 5 The Revenge of Michael Myers. There were many parts of 1980s horror. You had your supernatural with your poltergeist, like I mentioned. You had your zombie films such as Day of the Dead, and of course the comedy version of zombie film Return of the Living Dead and its sequel. Then you had, of course, the slasher boom was big that decade, and there's just so much to look at and digest out of this decade of horror. That's why I'm going to try to look at it each year at a time and kind of give some highlights. There's just so much to look at, and it's impossible to pick just 10 films and then ignore the rest. You have to talk about all of them, or you have to talk about the different years and some of the other films they've got. When I do my top 10 favorite films of the decade, I'm going to have to install some rules to make it easier for me to pick, or else the video would never end, because I'd have the whole thing would be honorable mentions and then a top 10. So, and I mean I mean, I know that's what most are, but the thing, you'd have a 50-minute video of honorable mentions and then a top 10 video, and so it'd be ridiculous. So in 1980, the films were still very much on the rip-off of Halloween phase. You still had Friday the 13th, which of course is a Halloween knockoff, and you had New Year's Evil, Prom Night, which Prom Night starred Jamie Lee Curtis, and of course Leslie Nielsen was in it too, for those of you playing at home. But and Terror Train, it was another one that had Jamie Lee Curtis in it, that was a slasher film that's in many ways is a knockoff of Halloween. But those are all good films, and I enjoy all of them. So I mean, it'd be hard to pick those. It's just the 80s, as I said, is a very rich and vast decade in which these horror films are gone. Now, 1980 also saw such classics as The Shining. And of course, that, if you know me, that is one of the greatest horror movies of all time. Granted, it's a little weird, but it is one of the greatest horror films ever made, thanks in no small part to Jack Nicholson's very fine performance. Dress to Kill is another one of those movies that it's not really a knockoff of Halloween, but it is I classify it as a slasher movie. As it turns out, and spoiler warning, Michael Caine's psychiatrist character dresses up like a woman and kills people that she's jealous of. It's almost more of a Norman Bates-y thing, which that's another series that got some sequels in the 1980s, Psycho. Anthony Perkins picked up the role of Norman Bates again. Again, there's so much to talk about in the 80s, and I'm probably going about this the wrong way, just talking about it, but I don't know how much. There is no way I could sit down and organize all this and make it come out other than to look at lists, because I'm going to forget about something. I'm going to forget about some movie, some horror movie that I wish I would have talked about. So I've got in front of me on the computer, if you're wondering what I'm doing, I have a list from the different years of the 80s of horror films, and I'm bringing them up and I'm scrolling through them. And ones I see I want to mention, I'll mention. But City of the Living Dead is another one. It's one of those Lucio Fulci, and I probably said that wrong, and I apologize for that. It's the first film in his Gateway to Hell trilogy, which features City of the Living Dead, Beyond, and House by the Cemetery. It's another classic from the 80s that, in my opinion, is essential horror viewing for the horror fan. In 1981, we had The Burning, which had a very young Jason Alexander, who would go on to Seinfeld fame. Again, that is a slasher film, almost in the same vein as Friday the 13th, but it's another good horror film to watch, and Tom Savini did the makeup effects in it as well. Final Exam, another good slasher film. Ghost Story. So Ghost Story is a good haunted house story. So this one's a good jumping off point. Ghost Story has Fred Astaire, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Alice Cringe. So these guys who were all in love with the Alice Cringe character accidentally drown her when they're young, and several years later, there are some more deaths going around, and she's going around, her ghost is going around killing them, and these old men are now coming to terms with their past, and that they accidentally killed her. They thought they killed her, and they locked her in a car and ran it into the lake or pond. Not sure which it was, but come to find out she wasn't dead yet. So again, it's an excellent ghost story that I also highly recommend, that I will get its own review at some point. Like I say, Final Exam's another good slasher. Halloween 2, solid sequel to John Carpenter's 1981 film. I know a lot of people don't like the brother-sister angle. Again, the Halloween franchise will get talked about to death next month, so I'm going to try to stay away from those as much as I can. We got the third Omen movie, which had Sam Neill, Lisa Harrow, Mason Adams. If you've seen if you liked the first two Omen movies, you'd like this one. It's not as good as the first two. With the first one, of course, had Gregory Peck, and the second one was Damien, which followed the kid at the military academy. This one isn't quite as good, but it's still very entertaining. The Prowler. Now, I reviewed the soundtrack to that one earlier on. The Prowler is a very solid slasher film. Joseph Zito, who would direct Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter. I know Part 4 isn't part of that one, but he directed that film. It's one of my top 10. That one has to be in my top 10 favorite horror films from the decade. It's very well made. It's got great effects. It's again, it's going to get its own review too. So, in 1982, we had an anthology film called Creepshow. Now, that was the brainchild of Stephen King and George Romero, and it was a throwback to the old gore-filled comic books from the 50s and 60s. It had 5 completely unrelated stories, and had a lot of stars in it. Had Leslie Nielsen, Ted Danson, E.G. Marshall, Stephen King himself is in it. It's another one of those classic films. It'll get its own review too, so hate to talk too much about it in here. Of course, Friday the 13th Part 3 hit, so we have of course in the 3D phase, and craze, I guess, would be the thing to say for that. Let's see, what else is there? Poltergeist. I just reviewed that one. Classic film. Tenebrae, the Dario Argento film with John Saxon, and The Thing, the original Thing with, not the original one with James Arness, but not the one that came out this last decade, but the one that came with Kurt Russell and Keith David and Wilford Brimley. It's masterful film by John Carpenter. It's not my favorite Carpenter film, as you guys have probably figured out at this point, but it's definitely one that bears talking about, and that is a solid film. Children of the Corn came out in 1984. Being a farmer and someone who grows a lot of corn every year, I know how easy it is to get turned around in a cornfield, especially if you don't follow the rows and all that stuff. So Children of the Corn is one of those films that a lot of people don't like it as well as a lot of the other horror films. It's one that I do enjoy just because of its... they did a good job of capitalizing on the creepiness of a cornfield, and that makes it gives it bonus points in my book. But I know that another one of those films that's good in the 80s, Night of the Comet. It's kind of a post-apocalyptic film. The comet comes and everybody that was watching it dies. It's a fun film to watch. It's kind of a zombie-ish film. It's kind of, if you think about it, it's a lot in the same realm as the Omega Man, and that it's post-apocalyptic, but it's a fun film. It's another one I recommend. Gremlins is a blast. Gremlins is a movie I have to watch every Christmas season. I know technically it's horror, but to me that's a Christmas movie to me. I've got to watch it. It takes place at Christmas. The big argument is about whether Die Hard's a Christmas movie or Lethal Weapon. It's Gremlins. Gremlins is a Christmas movie. I mean, that's the no-brainer out of this. I know. Ghostbusters is, of course, a fun horror comedy to watch. You got ghosts, you got Bill Murray, you got Dan Aykroyd. What's not to love about that film? Of course, Nightmare on Elm Street came in 1984. There was a documentary that came out that year called Terror in the Aisles that Donald Pleasance and Nancy Allen hosted. It was a solid retrospective on horror, and it's actually been released in a bundle with the Halloween 2 from Universal that I actually showed you guys in my new pickups video from August of 2020, so I recommend checking that one out as well. Silent Night, Deadly Night is a movie about a guy who dresses up like Santa Claus that goes around killing people, and it corresponded to sequels and all that. That's one I'll probably wait and talk about till closer to Christmas, just because. But again, 1984 was another solid year for horror. A couple films I already forgot about. Firestarter came out in 1984. I missed it just now. And earlier, I missed out on Wes Craven's Deadly Blessing. Deadly Blessing had Ernest Borgnine and Sharon Stone, and of course that was before she was real famous. And those are also a couple of solid horror movies that have to be in the discussion of any big discussion about 80s horror. House by the Cemetery, the last of Fulci's Gates of Hell trilogy. It's also a solid movie. Of course, that one, beginning and the setup's really good. The payoff at the end's a little on the weaker side, but as a whole, solid film. 1985, we had The Imposter Jason in Friday the 13th, A New Beginning. Day of the Dead, Romero's second sequel to Night of the Living Dead, known, of course, for its scene at the end with the zombies picking out on the military guys. Solid film. I own it. I own the older Blu-ray from Anchor Bay, and then I also have the Scream Factory Blu-ray. And I plan on selling neither, so that tells you what esteem I hold that film. Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2. I didn't care for that one. That's one I'm going to admit that I did not like nearly as much as I did in some of the others in the series. Phenomena, another Dario Argento film. That one had Jennifer Connelly. Reanimator, Jeffrey Combs is in that. That's a good film. That's one of those movies that you watch whenever you want to turn your mind off and watch a good horror movie. It's a fun one to watch. Return of the Living Dead's the same way. It's you got to call it a horror comedy. It's got a lot of gore, but it's a fun movie to watch as well. It doesn't take the zombie thing too seriously. There's a lot of fun movies like that to watch in this decade. And of course, I forgot Evil Dead. And then you have Evil Dead 2, but Dead by Dawn are both products of the 80s. The first Evil Dead in my opinion, is a cult classic, and right up there with some of the best low-budget B horror films ever made. Evil Dead 2 is one of those films that's, I don't want to say so bad it's good, but it's intentionally so. It's a fun movie to watch. Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 came out in '86. It is a significant step down from the original. Toby Hooper returns, but it's can almost be seen as a dark comedy. It's could have been a lot better than it was, but it's still an enjoyable film. It's certainly better than what else you got in the franchise later. Terror Vision is a film in which an alien monster called a Hungry Beast gets beamed to Earth through satellite TV transmissions and ends up eating all the monsters and changing shape. It's another one of those movies that's so bad it's good. I don't care what decade of horror you're in, you're going to find a lot of that. The 80s is no different. Maximum Overdrive, of course, is a movie where the trucks come to life and start killing people. It's a Stephen King film. It has Emilio Estevez and Yeardley Smith. Another fun creature movie to watch from the decade. It's campy. A lot of the movies in the 80s have a certain amount of camp to them, but that's part of what gives them their appeal to me anyway. Of course, Night of the Creeps. Jason Lively, who was in European Vacation, and is Blake Lively's older brother, actually. Poltergeist 2 came out in the 80s. What year am I on? Am I still on 86? Yeah, 86. Psycho 3, the weakest of the three original Psycho movies, although that one is directed by Norman Bates, and it does have its moments. What else we got that decade, or that year? House. Any movie where you have Bull from Night Court in it as a ghoul / demon, you know you're in for a treat, because Richard Mole does a great job as in about anything he's in. Return to Horror High is another classic. The Stepfather, Slumber Party Massacre. Those are the kind. Slumber Party Massacre and its two sequels are kind of movies you sit up and watch on TV eating popcorn, because they're just fun B horror movies that you watch, because I don't want to say so bad they're good, because they're not really bad. The sequels aren't as good, but the original one is pretty good. Prince of Darkness is an excellent John Carpenter horror film. Speaking of John Carpenter horror films, I didn't mention The Fog, and I'm ashamed of myself for that. That is a solid film as the 80s definitely had some solid John Carpenter in it. John Carpenter, great horror director. Let's see what else we got. Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, Dream Warriors. In my opinion, it's definitely the best of the sequels. I have to wait and see until I review that series at some point as to whether that is one that where I rank it compared to the original. Charles Lee Ray, aka Chucky, burst onto the scene in 1988 in the first Child's Play. Jason returned and fought a telekinetic girl in Part 7, The New Blood, of the Friday the 13th franchise. Of course, I mentioned earlier, Michael Myers returns that year. Hellbound Hellraiser 2 is a product of 88. The Howling movies. The first two Howling movies are really good. I really liked them. There are some more 80s movies that need to be talked about. Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, is campy B horror at its best. Definitely, you should check it out. I know it's on Amazon Prime, so that's another play. It's fun when you watch. Of course, Arrow has their new release of that out too, so that's something else to consider when you're wondering about checking that one out. George Romero had Monkey Shines. Phantasm 2 also came out in 88. Poltergeist 3, Pumpkinhead, second Return of the Living Dead movie, Waxwork. The whole 1988 was an excellent horror year. By the time 1989 rolled around, the slasher subgenre was on decline. Horror in general was kind of on the decline. So the quality there is sometimes lacking, but there were still some good films in that decade. In that year, you had, of course, you had your big franchises. Freddy, Michael, and Jason all had films come out that year. The original Pet Sematary came out that year. Sleepaway Camp's another one of those fun movies. I know it didn't come out that year, but the third one did, and that made me think about it. Those movies by that point were so bad were also so bad they were good. Yes, I have guilty pleasures watching those. I don't want to call them stupid because I watch them, but watching those bad sequels that really aren't that good or deserve to make a lot of money. But hey, I'm not making movies of my own, so it's kind of hard for me to negatively comment on that. The 1980s has a vast array of horror to it. You have your science fiction horror, whether you're talking about Aliens or Night of the Comet, and that almost leads into the post-apocalyptic films. You have your slashers, and of course all the sequels and everything, whether you're talking about Michael, Jason, Freddy, Norman Bates. You have your horror comedies, Return of the Living Dead. Wanting to say Repossessed came out in that decade. If not, there'll be. I'll let you know down there, but I'm pretty sure it did. And of course, you had John Carpenter filmed. You had all the Stephen King adaptations. The 1980s is such a treasure trove of horror. It's my golden age of horror. I know that a lot of people probably would disagree with me, saying, "Oh, it's bad horror," but dang it, it's what I grew up with, and it's what I enjoy. And the 80s and 90s, to me, is when horror was truly, truly great. And that's one reason why I'm having so much trouble trying to pick 10 films from this decade. So I'll get it done, don't worry, but there is a lot to look at, that's for sure. Wes Craven, John Carpenter, all had great films. Romero had a couple jewels out there. Whether you're talking about The Thing or The Shining, there's certain films that are easy to put on the list. Then there's certain others that movies that you know aren't as good as others, but you grew up with them, and therefore they've got a special place in your heart, and it's kind of hard to leave them off of a top 10 list. But that's all I've really got for this video. I just wanted to rattle off, I guess, a lot of the horror movies from the decade that I love. I know I'll not get to all of them this year. I'll not get to cover anywhere near half of them this year. But I certainly couldn't do the decade justice in a top 10, but you will still get a top 10, I promise. But there isn't really anything in depth in this video. I apologize. I just wanted to list off some of my favorite films from the decade. So, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and please consider subscribing to this channel. I try to have new content daily. It doesn't always work that way, but that's my goal. We're in the horror season now, so with a few exceptions, it's going to be exclusively horror content. So if you like horror, be sure you subscribe and hit that bell notification so you know when the next video's up. Follow me on Facebook or Twitter. Just search for Bob the Film Guy. I'll keep you updated there. And for now, thanks for watching. Stay safe, everyone. This is Bob, signing off.